Very good evening, dear students. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy. So we will be discussing some important current affairs topics which are covered in different newspapers. Remember, all these topics that we are going to discuss are very important for your prelims and mains examinations. So what we do here is that we do the micro detailing of every news article which is important for your examinations. We'll start this discussion with the first very important topic, that is a disaster management amendment bill 2024, and that has been passed in the both houses of the parliament. And we'll understand what is this disaster management bill and why there is a need for amendments in the disaster management act 2005 that was already passed. Now, as I have already told you that this disaster management bill that was introduced in 2024, it was already passed in the Lok Sabha. However, recently it has also got passed in the Rajya Sabha as well. And in fact, the parliament, both Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, have passed the disaster management amendment bill 2024. And in fact, the overall objective of amending the disaster management act 2005 is to further strengthen the disaster response mechanisms. And we knew that the intensity and the frequency of various disasters have been increasing manifold because of the climate change and other weather related extremes. And therefore, don't you think that we need to further strengthen the existing disaster preparedness and also disaster response mechanisms so that we could actually reduce the mortality rate, we could actually reduce the vulnerability of people to various such disasters. And because of that reason, this bill has been introduced in the parliament, and parliament already passed this bill, and it is yet to receive the assent of the president, because we all knew that the procedure to pass a bill is that it should be introduced in either house of the parliament, it should be passed in both houses of the parliament, then it will goes to the president for her assent. So once president gives her assent, so this bill will become an act. Now, first of all, we should understand the disaster management act. So in fact, India has seen a deadly tsunami in the year 2004 December. So after this deadly tsunami and a huge destruction that was created by this deadly tsunami has compelled the parliament to pass a disaster management act of 2005. And if you look at this architecture of the disaster management act 2005, so it has a three-tier mechanism. It has a three-tier structure. So three-tier structure: first at the top level, the central government, and at the intermediary level, state governments, and also the district administration. And at the central level, we have National Disaster Management Authority. It is also called as NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, at the top level, and this is a 10-member body, and it is chaired by whom? Prime Minister. So it is a 10-member body and it is chaired by Prime Minister, and it is hosted by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So under this, there is a National Executive Committee, and this is chaired by Home Secretary. Right? So in fact, this is the National Disaster Management Authority is hosted by Ministry of Home Affairs, and Ministry of Home Affairs is also known as the Disaster Management Cell, because under the Ministry of Home Affairs, National Disaster Response Force and the National Institute of Disaster Management would function. So these two institutions, bodies, forces, they function under the Ministry of Home Affairs because it is the disaster management cell at the union level. So I hope it is clear. And in fact, the function of the National Executive Committee is to prepare disaster management plans, and also execute them is the duty or the responsibility of the National Executive Committee, that is chaired by Home Secretary. So we have understood this is the architecture at the union level. However, at the state government level, so we have a state disaster management authority. It is chaired by whom? It is chaired by Chief Minister, and state disaster management authority is a 8-member body. So National Disaster Management Authority is a 10-member body and it is chaired by Prime Minister. Similarly, the State Disaster Management Authority has also been established by Disaster Management Act 2005 and it is an 8-member body and it is chaired by the Chief Minister. And similarly, to prepare disaster management plans at the level of state executive committee is also established. However, the State Executive Committee is chaired by the Chief Secretary of the state. However, at the district level, district administration, we have panchayats and also the municipalities. And in district level, District Disaster Management Authority has been created, and the chairperson of the District Disaster Management Authority is the District Collector. So District Collector, and it was co-chaired by the chairperson of Jilla Parishad. So this is the architecture that has been established by the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And in fact, the overall objective of the Disaster Management Act 2005 is to reduce the vulnerability of the country to various disasters, and also strengthen the responsiveness and also preparedness for various disasters that could strike India, and further reduce the vulnerability of the nation for such a disasters. So this is the architecture that has been established under the National Disaster Management Act 2005. So I hope it is clear for you. Now we'll understand the key features and amendments of the Disaster Management Amendment Bill of 2024, and that has been recently passed by the Rajya Sabha or the Parliament. Right, so this is with respect to Disaster Management Amendment Bill 2024, and we'll understand what are the key features of this Disaster Management Amendment Bill 2024. And in fact, disaster management plans would be created, right? So disaster management plans would be created. So we just discussed that. So we have just discussed that Disaster Management Act has created National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authority. So earlier, not National Disaster Management Authority and the State Disaster Management Authority, they don't have the powers to prepare plans, right? So National Disaster Management Authority, under this there are executive committees. So these executive committees under the Home Secretary were given the responsibility to prepare plans for disaster management. But now, under this amendment, both NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, and State Disaster Management Authority would have the powers to prepare plans, and in fact it has replaced the delegation to the executive committees. So as I have already told you that previously the power to prepare plans was given to the executive committees, but under this amendment the powers to create plans were given to the National Disaster Management Authority and the State Disaster Management Authority. And apart from that, the functions of both National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authority have been further strengthened or further expanded, right? So the powers include the powers which are expanded for both National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authority, including risk assessment, right? So a proper risk assessment of any disaster would be done in a much more comprehensive manner by both these institutions, including the climate related risks. Now, what are those climate related risks which could be done a risk assessment? For example, when I say climate related risks, the glacial lake outburst, floods, so that could be considered as a climate related risk, and heat wave, a climate related weather phenomena, heat wave phenomenons like El Nino and its impact on weather or climate in India, because El Nino would most likely create drought like conditions, La Nina would result in floods in India, and sea level rises, storm surges. So all these are some climate related risks that are associated, and they also create a large scale destruction. So therefore, here I would like to tell you that the powers of both NDMA and State Disaster Management Authority have further expanded, and the powers include risk assessment of various disasters, including the climate related risks as well. And apart from that, the other key feature of the amended Disaster Management Bill 2024 is that providing technical guidance and also minimum relief standards. So there should be a minimum relief standards that the government has to provide in the case of any disaster, which is part of the Disaster Management Amendment Bill 2024, right? So there should be minimum relief standard that the government would follow. Imagine that there is an earthquake in a particular region. So in case an earthquake in a particular region, what the government will do, so the government will describe a minimum relief standard that will be provided. For example, evacuation of people and constructing shelter homes, temporary shelter homes, providing all necessary provisions for those people who are living in these shelter homes. And apart from that, the post disaster recovery. As part of the post disaster recovery, various measures are being followed by the government. So that includes housing, healthcare, education, livelihood of the people. So all these are part of the minimum relief standards that the government would follow during the disaster and post disaster as well. And similarly, data is very, very important when it comes to understanding the impact of such disasters, right? So when we have adequate data, it would result in what? Evidence-based policy making and also the data-driven policy making. It would result in data-driven and evidence-based policy making, and it will also help us deal with disasters in a much more effective and efficient manner. So therefore, the amended bill would also have provisions for national and state level disaster database, so that we would be much more effective and efficient when it comes to dealing with such disasters. And similarly, conducting post disaster audits and also assessing the state preparedness is also another very important aspect that is focused on through this amendment bill, because once the disaster struck a particular area, so a post disaster audit would be done, and also we assess the state of preparedness. So by this, the advantage is that if that particular area again struck by any disaster, then we would actually make changes to our preparedness. So what are the shortcomings of our preparedness while this area was struck by a disaster previously, and so that it would result in best possible disaster preparedness, and it would result in reduction in the vulnerability of that particular area, as well as mitigation and adaptation for new such disasters that could likely struck this area. And apart from that, in recent times, urban areas in India are also more and more vulnerable to various disasters. For example, urban floods are phenomenon, and that has been observed across various cities. For example, cities like Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bengaluru, and even for that matter Delhi also experiencing the urban floods very frequently. So therefore, the disaster management authorities to be set up in state capitals and cities within the municipal corporations, so that the likelihood of such disasters in these urban areas could be mitigated, right? And the vulnerability of the urban areas for such disasters can be substantially reduced. And apart from that, there are other key features of the bills as well. We have already discussed the creation of disaster databases at the national and the state levels. So both at the national level and at the state level, this disaster databases are being created, and it includes disaster assessment, fund allocation for various disasters, and expenditure during the disaster and post such disaster recovery, preparedness, mitigation plans, and also risk registers. So it will include all these different details. So along with this database, all these different dimensions are part of the Disaster Management Amendment Bill of 2024. And in fact, the Disaster Management Amendment Bill 2024, it also grants the statutory status to National Crisis Management Committee and also the High Level Committee, and it would result in much more efficient and effective functioning of both National Crisis Management Committee as well as High Level Committee. And we could actually enhance their proactive way of providing relief for the people who are impacted by any such disasters, by providing statutory status to both National Crisis Management Committee as well as High Level Committee. And new section 60A has been added. So this section 60A empowers the central and state governments to direct individuals on disaster management actions and also impose penalties of up to 10,000 rupees for non-compliance with such directions given by the central and the state governments. And apart from that, what is the need for the amendments? So why these amendments are actually brought in? So we should also understand this dimension as well. So first of all, one thing that we should understand, if you look at India, in India, vulnerability to such disasters has been substantially increasing in recent times, right? So since vulnerability to various disasters has been increasing enormously, particularly because of the climate change and global warming. So with climate change and global warming, what has been happening? So there is an increasing intensity and frequency of weather phenomena like heat waves that we recently observe, and a phenomenon like landslides are also increasing that we have observed in states like Kerala, and glacial lake outburst floods that are also being observed, and urban floods is a phenomenon, and different parts of the country are also experiencing droughts, and India is also vulnerable to earthquakes. It is also vulnerable to earthquakes and several other disasters that we have been experiencing every day, and this requires better response. This actually requires what? This actually requires better response. And in fact, the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction and Hugo framework on disaster risk reduction, so they both emphasized on the better response, better preparedness, better response and better preparedness, along with the resilient infrastructure building. So because of that particular reason, and because of increasing climate change and global warming, there is a need to build resilience to such disasters. So don't you think that there is a need to make or bring amendments to the existing Disaster Management Act of 2005, which is outdated? With the changing nature of such disasters, we should also bring some changes into these existing Disaster Management Act provisions as well, so that it would result in better preparedness, better planning, better response, and we could also build resilient infrastructure. And apart from that, both center and state governments can work in sync with each other to deal with any such new disasters, right? So that is why there is a need for the amendments. So as we have already discussed, that there is a rise in extreme climate events, and since there is a rise in extreme climate events, and those extreme climate events are associated with various such new disasters or increasing intensity and frequency of such disasters, there is a need for the proactive disaster planning. And in fact, the states have been facing difficulties in 2005 Disaster Management Act's execution framework. So this is what is called as the decentralization gaps. Maybe the state governments are not given adequate powers to deal with the various disasters, and since state governments or the district authorities are the first responders in case of any disasters, there is a need to bridge these decentralization gaps, and that is also another major reason to bring amendments to the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And similarly, there are various institutions which are created under the Disaster Management Act of 2005. So what are those institutions? For example, the National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authority, as well as District Disaster Management Authority. So these are some various institutions which are created under the Disaster Management Act, and there is a need to strengthen these institutions adequately. For example, a technical support has to be provided for these institutions, and these institutions should have access to adequate data. These institutions should also have access to the finances that will help strengthen the capacities of these institutions. So therefore, this Disaster Management Amendment Bill aims to create accountable, well-defined structures at the national level and even at the subnational level. And similarly, data and technology integration with the disaster management preparedness, disaster management response, relief, and also resilience to various such disasters, right? For example, the satellite data can be used. For example, there are certain remote sensing satellites, or those remote sensing satellites would be able to provide the details with respect to the vulnerability of different regions in the country. And apart from that, so having access to the data related to the various disasters and the vulnerability of various areas, and new and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence can also be effectively used for disaster mitigation and also disaster response. Now on this image you can see what exactly is disaster management, right? And also the cycle of disaster management. So for example, when a disaster struck a particular area, for example, imagine that this is the coastal belt of India, particularly the eastern coastal belt of India. The eastern coastal belt of India is vulnerable to cyclones. So this area is vulnerable to cyclones, and a cyclone would likely struck this particular area, and that is known as a disaster. So if any cyclone struck the eastern coast of India, and that creates a huge destruction, and that may be called as a disaster. And when disaster took place, the response of the government is the immediate necessity, right? So the government would respond by sending the national disaster response force for that particular area to undertake relief and rescue operations. So once this response is done, recovery has to be done, right? So recovery is very, very important. So recovery would takes place after the disaster struck. After response, recovery would take place, and then we would plan mitigation, right? For example, when super cyclone struck Odisha's coast during 1999, it has created a huge destruction, and it has also resulted in a death of several individuals. But because of the mitigation efforts that are being undertaken by the state government of Odisha along with the support of the central government, it has resulted in a rapid reduction in the deaths of people after a number of cyclones hit the Odisha's coast. So that highlights the importance of mitigation, because mitigation reduces the vulnerability of people to various disasters. And preparedness, so that area would be vulnerable for a number of cyclones in future also. So therefore we should be prepared to deal with such cyclones in the future as well. So that is what is called as preparedness. So when we have a better preparedness, even if any such disaster struck that particular region which is adequately prepared, the impact of such disaster would be substantially less on that area. So here the definitions of preparedness, response, recovery, and also mitigation have been given. So you can see here what exactly is the meaning of preparation. So preparedness is activities which are undertaken prior to a disaster. So the disaster not yet strikes a region, but the activities that are undertaken prior to a disaster. For example, preparedness plans that are put in place, and emergency exercises, trainings, early warning systems. So all these things are part of the preparedness. Similarly, when we look into the response for any disaster, so activities during a disaster forms part of the response. For example, public warning systems, emergency operations, search and rescue, relief and rescue operations. So all these things comes part of the response. And recovery is another important aspect in the disaster management cycle. So these are the activities following a disasters. For example, constructing a temporary housing, claims processing and grants, and long-term medical care, counseling to the people who are affected by such disasters. So all these things forms part of the disaster management cycle. Now there are some issues with the new disaster management bill of 2024, and we'll try to understand what are those issues with the new disaster management bill. So the first issue is the opposition parties have been arguing that the new disaster management bill 2024 would result in the centralization of powers, and they also criticize this new disaster management amendment bill. It has been undermining the federal balance, right? So this indicates that the union government or the center likely encroaching upon the powers, right? So it has been likely encroaching upon the powers of the state governments, right? So this is what is called as undermining the federal balance. So it has been undermining federal balance. It has been undermining the federal balance. And secondly, potential encroachment on the state authority in disaster planning and also the fund utilization, right? So there is a potential encroachment. So as I have mentioned that, so that is why the opposition parties have been claiming that the disaster management bill of 2024 would potentially encroach upon the powers of the respective state government, and it also undermines the federal balance, because with respect to disaster management, disaster planning, disaster preparedness, and also fund utilization, the central government has been encroaching upon the powers of the state governments, and it has been undermining the federal balance. And in fact, the National Disaster Response Force allocation control greater central monitoring, so that may delay centralized relief efforts, right? So in fact, the greater central monitoring actually delay the decentralized relief efforts when it comes to the NDRF. And in fact, so exclusion of some important disasters such as heat waves. So there is a huge demand from several states that heat waves should be considered part of the disaster, right? So heat waves should be considered as a disaster because several states have been facing the risk of extreme heat waves. So they have been facing the risk of extreme heat waves, and it is very, very important that in case if it is included as a disaster, then the state government would likely receive funds, and those funds could be used for putting the heat wave action plans and shelter homes, heat wave action plans, shelter homes, healthcare facilities, primary healthcare facilities, so building healthcare infrastructure or taking care of the vulnerable people, and also insurance to the work lost due to the heat waves. So all these different things would be carried out by the state governments with the funds of the disaster management fund, national disaster management fund or state disaster management fund, in case of heat wave is included as part of the definition of a disaster. So that is another major problem with the Disaster Management Amendment Bill of 2024. And similarly, there is a lack of dedicated space specific relief budgets. In fact, states like Bihar have been demanding region focused disaster funding, right? For example, there are some regions, some states in India which are more vulnerable to various disasters, and those areas are also facing extreme levels of poverty, lack of infrastructure, extreme levels of poverty, lack of infrastructure or lack of infrastructure resilience, high vulnerability to various disasters. So one example would be the state of Odisha. The state of Odisha, so it has been facing poverty and it has been lacking infrastructure. So because of all these problems, several states started demanding that there should be a state specific funding so that the state governments would reduce their vulnerability to various disasters. So you could actually see the various phases of disaster management here. So when we talk about various phases of disaster management, in case a disaster would likely struck a particular area, then a national emergency telecommunication response plans that should be put in place. There should be early warning mechanisms, training and exercises, standard operations that have to be carried out along with other important procedures. And communication and coordination is very, very important between the center, states and district authorities, and that would help save lives, and that would also help reduce the vulnerability of people to various such disasters. And restoring telecommunication infrastructure, improving lives of the people, recovery, rehabilitation and other services, and public awareness have to be provided, education of people has to be done, hazard vulnerability assessment has to be carried out, and there should be improved infrastructure also. So these are different phases of disaster management, and this is in a nutshell the Disaster Management Amendment Bill of 2024. And next important topic is global warming and its impact on mountainous regions. We all knew that global warming is a phenomenon because of the greenhouse gases that are emitted by various anthropogenic factors. So these anthropogenic factors have resulted in emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, black carbon and other various greenhouse gases, and these greenhouse gases resulting in a phenomenon called global warming. So global warming for an extended period of time would result in changes in the climate, and that is called as climate change, right? So I hope it is very clear. So with the global warming, with increasing temperatures of the planet Earth, the mountains that are actually covered with the glaciers, so those glaciers are melting, and since those glaciers are melting, it has resulted in increasing the sea surface levels and releasing of carbon, which is stored in these glaciers, right? So when the carbon is released into the atmosphere, the carbon would likely attract the heat, and that would also further contributes to the global warming as well, right? So we'll briefly understand the global warming and its impact on the mountains, right? So recently UNESCO has published a report. The title of the report is United Nations World Water Development Report of 2025. So this is the title of the report, Mountains and Glaciers. And this particular report that has been released by the UNESCO has highlighted that the impact of increasing temperatures, the impact of the global warming on the world's mountain ranges. So how world's mountain ranges have been facing various threats, facing various risks because of the global warming or increasing temperatures of the planet Earth. And in fact, this report that has been released by the UNESCO has also highlighted that the higher elevations are warming at a faster pace than the lower elevations. So for example, imagine that this is the Himalayan mountains. So these are called as the higher elevations. So according to this particular report, the higher elevations are warming at a faster pace. So that means that the glacial melting at the higher elevations is taking place rather than the warming at the lower elevations. So thereby it has been leading to much more accelerated glacier melt, increased permafrost thawing, and even decline in the snow cover as well, right? Because of the exposure of these glaciers and these mountains to the higher temperatures because of the global warming, what has been happening? So the glacier melting has been further accelerated, and increased permafrost thawing has also been taking place. Because of the permafrost thawing, the carbon which is embedded in these glaciers would be released into the atmosphere, and even it also leads to the declining snow cover, and that would ultimately result in rising sea levels. However, the snowfall patterns have also become more erratic, and that further affecting the water availability as well. So remember that glaciers are one of the main sources of the freshwater rivers, and once these glaciers started melting at a faster rate, then you won't have adequate amount of fresh water to drink or for various other purposes, and you would likely face the water crisis in case of the melting of glaciers takes place at such an unprecedented level, right? So we'll understand the glacier melting at an unprecedented rate. So it is being said that the glaciers all across the world are disappearing at a faster pace, and you might hear in newspapers that the glaciers and ice blocks in Antarctica and Arctic, so they are breaking away and they are also melting at a faster pace because of the global warming, right? So in fact, in last 3 years it is witnessed that there has been a largest glacial mass loss on record. So that means that since temperatures are increasing, so increasing temperatures have resulted in the melting of glaciers. The phenomena of melting of glaciers is also further enhanced. So that has resulted in largest glacial mass loss on record in last 3 years. However, since 1975, glaciers excluding the Greenland and Antarctica ice sheets have lost over 9,000 billion. So they have lost over 9,000 billion tons of mass. And that is equivalent to an ice block the size of Germany, right? So that is equivalent to a size of ice block the size of Germany. And what are the causes of this accelerated glacial melting? So there's no doubt only the major factor or the primary factor is rising temperatures. So rising temperature is one factor. Because of the rising temperatures, it could put a lot of pressure on existing glaciers in these high altitude mountains, and these glaciers are started melting because of the higher temperatures. And earlier, when global warming was not at that peak, these glaciers was relatively stable, relatively safe. However, because of the increasing global temperatures, these glaciers are started melting, and this is considered as a primary factor. Now, apart from temperatures, there are other factors also. For example, we see wildfires. Recently we have seen Californian wildfires in Australia, and wildfires in several parts of India also. So these wildfires and dust storms are also contributing heavily for the melting of glaciers. And when these dust storms and wildfires takes place, the black carbon which is suspended in the air, that black carbon is deposited on the glaciers, right? So the black carbon, so along with the black carbon, the particulate matter is also which is suspended on the air, so that is actually deposited on these glaciers, and they could likely accelerate the process of melting. Because what happens is that, I hope you knew about the phenomena of albedo, right? So when this black carbon and particulate matter, they are suspended on the air, when they are deposited on the outer layer of the glacier, so they actually attract a lot of sunlight, so they absorb a lot of sunlight. So absorbing sunlight means that the temperatures over the outer layer of glacier increasing or rising, and that would result in the melting of glaciers, that would result in the faster melting of glaciers. So this is very important phenomenon that you should understand here, and it would further accelerate melting, particularly in areas and periods of high sunlight exposure. So whenever these areas are exposed to higher sunlight, they start melting, right? So however, accelerating permafrost thaw, right? So accelerating permafrost thaw is also another major reason for the increasing melting of these glaciers. And in fact, this permafrost that remains frozen for at least 2 consecutive years is also rapidly melting due to the rising temperatures, right? So we knew, because of the global warming, what has been happening? Because of the global warming, the temperatures of the planet Earth have been increasing at a substantial pace, right? Now, since temperatures are increasing, what has been happening? So this permafrost has been started warming up, right? So the permafrost has also started warming up. Now, what exactly is a permafrost? So permafrost is a perennially frozen ground covering a quarter of land in the northern hemisphere at the Arctic region, right? So this is a frozen ground, a perennially frozen ground, and that has been covering at least a quarter of land in the northern hemisphere. So since this permafrost started warming up, the frozen organic matter thaws and started decaying, right? So the frozen organic matter started decaying. So if it is started decaying, it would release the greenhouse gases like carbon, right? So this decay would release the carbon into the atmosphere as the greenhouse gas. So not just carbon, it also releases both CO2 plus methane as well. So it also releases carbon dioxide and methane, and emissions from these permafrost thawing would further accelerate the global warming, which then accelerate the permafrost melt or glacial melt. So thereby it would result in the melting of glaciers, or it would further accelerate the melting of glaciers. So I hope you have understood this permafrost thawing. So permafrost is a perennially frozen ground area, and in fact it is expected that the permafrost thawing is very concerning, because the mountain permafrost stores approximately 4.5% of the global soil, right? So global soil, it actually stores 4.5% of the global soil organic carbon. And when this permafrost is thawed, this carbon is released into the atmosphere, and that would further exacerbate the climate change, right? So this is what we have just discussed and understood. And additionally, permafrost also plays a crucial role in stabilizing the rock slopes, moraines and debris covered areas, right? So this permafrost is very important, but as the permafrost started melting, these landscapes becomes more prone to phenomena like erosion, landslides and other geological hazards also. So this is how it has a huge impact on different, it is actually a chain reaction, right? So once a global warming takes place, it would leads to the melting of glaciers would result in permafrost melting would result in the release of carbon into the atmosphere in turn increases the global warming as well, and it would also weaken the existing geological structures which are embedded in the permafrost as well. Now, what is the significance of this particular study? So we should also try to understand the significance of the study. So the significance is that the mountains ecosystem as of now cover around 33 million square kilometers of Earth's surface. So it is actually a huge Earth surface which is covered by the mountains, and mountains also play a very important role when it comes to the sustaining life of individuals, right? A number of people still live or dependent on the mountain ecosystem, and it is also expected that when we have glaciers are the sources of the freshwater rivers, and freshwater rivers would provide water for the drinking water, and water is very important for the sustenance of life on this planet. So it is expected that nearly 2 billion people dependent on fresh water, and this fresh water is originated or sourced from these glaciers. So when glaciers are melting at a faster pace, it would result in water crisis in future. It would result in water scarcity in future in number of areas. However, the most vulnerable would be people from poor, developing and underdeveloping countries, right? So however, rapid glacier melting due to climate change also threatens the water availability and making flows more erratic, uncertain and also variable as well. And apart from that, it is going to disrupt the timing, quantity and quality of water resources downstream. So as I have already talked to you, that it would likely create or result in the water crisis or water scarcity, and thereby it would impact agriculture sector, it would impact drinking water supply, and it would also impact the availability of hydropower as well. However, the glacier melting and permafrost thawing are increasing the risk of glacial lake outburst floods, sudden catastrophic floods which are being caused by the failure of the natural glacial dams. So the major reason is melting of glaciers, and in fact this glacial lake outburst floods that we have already experienced in several parts of the Himalayas in India. And in fact, the melted glacier ice accounts for 25 to 30% of the rise in global sea levels as well. And in fact, it is expected that every 1 millimeter of sea level rise actually puts around 3 lakh people at the risk of annual flooding as well. Because of the annual flooding, people have to be evacuated and people have to leave those areas which are highly vulnerable, and it would also likely contribute to the problem of climate refugees as well. So it would also likely contribute to the problem of climate refugees as well, and there is a need for climate action at the global level. So there is a need for increased collaboration to deal with all all these problems. However, this phenomena is also very concerning in India as well, because of the increasing global warming, increasing temperatures. The glaciers in the Hindu Kush mountains are also melting at a faster pace, and that could likely threaten the freshwater rivers like Ganga, Brahmaputra, Yamuna, and the availability of water in those rivers would also be substantially declined in future, and that would likely create a huge water scarcity, because the availability of water is not that much. And in fact, these mountains are also source of they are also rich biodiversity hotspots as well. And in fact, these Hindu Kush mountains spans from Afghanistan to up to Myanmar, and they are actually encompassing 4.2 million square kilometers. And if we talk about these Hindu Kush mountains are the source of around 10 major rivers, right? So they are sources of around 10 major rivers, right? For example, Ganga, Brahmaputra, and Indus River. So all these major rivers are sourced from the Hindu Kush mountains, and in fact around 240 million people's livelihood is also dependent on these rivers and the mountains from where these rivers are originated. And in fact around 1.9 billion people are living downstream of these rivers. When water levels are started declining, the people downstream and their lives and livelihoods would get impacted. And in fact, of the 8 countries which are part of the Hindu Kush range, India has the highest population of 50.3 million distributed across 11 mountain states, right? So when we talk about the mountain states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, and Uttarakhand, parts of Bihar and West Bengal, Himachal Pradesh, Ladakh, Jammu and Kashmir. So therefore, they are distributed across 11 mountain states as part of Hindu Kush. And researchers are also started warning more political unrest in the region due to the conflicts over natural resources, especially the river water. So it is said that the future wars are the water wars. When glaciers are melting at a faster pace because of the anthropogenic factors, it would result in the water scarcity. It would also result in the lack of water in the existing rivers, and that would likely create the conflicts between different states. That would result in more political unrest as well. So I hope you have understood this. Recently, there is a news that in Delhi High Court's Chief Justice, Delhi High Court Judge's house, it is found that Judge of Delhi High Court, it is found that a cash is burnt, right? So in his house, the cash is found at a burnt state. So it is found that there is a likelihood of corruption that took place, and the judge is also involved, and that has provoked a huge backlash. And in fact, the Supreme Court of India has also taken this very seriously, and the Supreme Court has initiated an in-house inquiry process for that particular judge in India. So we'll understand what exactly is this news, and what is in-house inquiry, and what is the process of removing judges. And recently, the Chief Justice of India, Sanjeev Khanna, started a special 3-member internal investigation, right? So the reason for starting a special 3-member internal investigation is that Delhi High Court judges Yashwant Verma's house was recently a fire alarm, a fire incident has taken place in Yashwant Verma's Justice Yashwant Verma's house, and the fire department has gone to his house, and the fire department has found that a pile of cash was burnt, right? So that's how this came to the limelight, and because of that reason, since a huge cash is found in his house, Chief Justice of India Sanjeev Khanna has started a special 3-member internal investigation on March 22nd. However, This has happened. This 3-member internal investigation committee has been set up after a bundles of cash were reportedly found at his official residence when a fire broke out on March 14. So after this, Justice Yashwant Verma was transferred from Delhi High Court to the Allahabad High Court. Right, so this internal investigation is different from impeachment of the judges process mentioned in the constitution. So impeachment of the judges is mentioned in the Constitution of India. However, there are 2 grounds. On those 2 grounds, judges can be impeached. So those are proved misbehavior, proved misbehavior and incapacity, or are 2 grounds. Based on these 2 grounds, a judge can be impeached. Impeachment of the judges, right? So in this context, we'll understand how can a judge be removed in India, right? So this is the procedure that has been provided now. In fact, impeachment is the process for the removal of the judges in India, whether the Supreme Court judge or the High Court judges, right? So how can a judge be removed in India? Because this is a very lengthy process and this is also a very, very important process. So impeachment process for the Supreme Court and High Court judges is given in Article 124 Clause 4 and Article 218 of the Indian Constitution, right? So Article 218, impeachment of the judge of the High Court, and Article 124 Clause 4 talks about the impeachment of the judge of the Supreme Court, right? So both these articles mention that a judge can only be removed on 2 grounds. Only on 2 grounds a judge can be removed. So that is proved misbehavior or incapacity. So these are 2 essential and 2 fundamental grounds a judge can be removed. And in fact, a parliament can remove a judge by a special majority. So 2/3 of members in the parliament, 2/3 of members in the parliament present and voting in both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha must approve. And apart from that, the votes must also be more than 50% of the total membership of the each house to remove judge of the Supreme Court and also High Court. However, before voting, a motion has to be passed. If the motion passes, the president orders the judge's removal, right? So if parliament is dissolved before the process is completed, the motion considered failed, right? So this motion would be failed in case the Lok Sabha is, or if the parliament is dissolved before the process of process of removal of judges of the Supreme Court or High Court is completed. Now we'll understand how was a in-house procedure created, right? So it is very important for us to understand this. How was the in-house procedure created? So a 5-member committee was formed in the year 1997, and this 5-member committee consisting of S.C. Agarwal, A.S. Anand and S.P. Baruch from Supreme Court, and P.S. Mishra and D.P. Mohapatra. So this is the 5-member committee that was established in the year 1997, and this 5-member committee has proposed that there should be a process to take action against judges who are violating the judicial ethics. So in case if any judge found violating the judicial ethics, then there should be a process to take action against such judges. And in fact, the Supreme Court has adopted this report in the year 1999 with some amendments. So this procedure to take action against the judges who are violating the judicial ethics is called as in-house procedure. So in-house procedure is different from the removal of the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court by the Parliament, and this in-house procedure actually includes allows complaints against the judges to be examined internally by the judiciary itself. And in fact, the complaint can be initiated by the Chief Justice of India or the Chief Justice of any other High Court. And in fact, this mechanism ensures a more expedient response to allegations than the impeachment process, because impeachment is a very lengthy process, and compared to the impeachment process, the in-house procedure is considered as a more expedient response to any judge who have found violating the judicial ethics, and that has been recommended by a 5-member committee in 1997. So what are the steps of inquiry process? So these are the steps of inquiry process. Firstly, receipt of complaint. For example, this complaint has been received against Yashwant Verma because of bundles of cash found in the house of Yashwant Verma, a Delhi High Court judge. So complaints can be received from various sources, including the Chief Justice of India and the President of India. So this is how the complaints can be received from various sources against a judge of the Supreme Court or High Court. So after the complaint is received, a preliminary assessment is conducted, right? As part of the preliminary assessment, the CJI may seek preliminary report from concerned High Court Chief Justice, right? So, and then formation of an inquiry committee. So in this case, the Chief Justice of India may request a preliminary report from the Chief Justice of Delhi High Court, Chief Justice of Delhi High Court, and then formation of an inquiry committee. So if warranted, a 3-member committee is being formed consisting of Chief Justices from other different high courts as well, and after that the inquiry procedure would be started, right? So the committee conducts an inquiry ensuring adherence to the natural justice principles, and after conducting a detailed inquiry, the committee submits its reports to the Chief Justice of India, indicating whether allegations hold any substance or not. So after that, based on the findings of the report, the committee may recommend removal proceedings or advise the judge to resign, right? So after that, it actually advised the judge to resign. So in case if judge refuses to resign, the Chief Justice of India informs the President to initiate the removal proceedings of the existing judge of the High Court. So this is how the inquiry process, in-house inquiry process, usually takes place. I hope you have understood this. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you like our class, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button.